The brave few who come and stay through lunch. Blessed are the brave. So hi everyone, really nice to meet you all. I'm Jason Jackson. I'm a professor in the Urban Studies and Planning Department at MIT. And today I want to talk to you about disruption, which is like the order of the day, week, month, decade, perhaps even more. But what I'd like to highlight within the context of disruption, and in particular disrupted platforms, is the sort of toggling back and forth with this metaphor of disruption that we use with the kind of technological on one hand, perhaps, and business model on the other, mode of disruption that of course is familiar to us when we think about platforms, and the role of regulation. Not just regulation as a thing to be disrupted, perhaps along with markets and competitors and so forth, but also how new forms of regulation are now emerging that are perhaps disrupting the disrupted platforms. So first, yep, great. All right, hopefully this will work. So first, to set the stage, the story that we're all familiar with, right? So it's one of growth. So what I'm going to show, this is a bunch of screenshots from a really nice report from the Business of Apps that provides some data on the growth of sort of mobility platforms. I mean, so most I'm going to focus on ride hailing. I'll say little things about delivery perhaps here and there, because delivery obviously has become, it's been important globally more or less from the beginning. The beginning is like 6 years ago, right? So it's pretty recent. But food delivery has been important globally from the beginning. But it's only really been taking off in the US probably in the last 2 to 3 years, right? But we'll talk about delivery as well. So what do we see? So this is the growth of the US ride-hailing market from 2015, sort of to the present, well, to last year. Revenue in billions of dollars, and it's going up, up, up. Obviously this is the pandemic. We can talk about that after, but I don't think it takes away from the sort of general story that we sort of know, which is this massive growth of platforms in the mobility space. And again, so this is user growth, so just as important in many ways as revenue growth, obviously, when we think about platforms. The only thing I'll note here, which is kind of really interesting, is that obviously this kind of just been continuing on this upward trajectory. There's been very little change between 2019 and 2020, which is sort of interesting when we think about the massive revenue drop-off, but whatever, that's sort of interesting. How the market is composed, in the US, obviously, so the ride-hailing market is more or less a duopoly. When I say ride-hailing now, I'm excluding just for the moment other providers of human transport in urban context, so obviously taxis, which are the big thing I'm going to come back to. But if we just think about ride-hailing itself, it's pretty much a duopoly between Uber and Lyft. This says food delivery, but that's actually a mistake. I think it should just be ride-hailing, because obviously Lyft doesn't really do that much food delivery. And if we're talking about food delivery, we'd have Instacart and those guys here. Okay, so let's step outside of the US for a moment and go to wetter and colder climes. So if we think about the UK, again, the pattern sort of looks similar, right? So, I mean, smaller market, but similar sort of story of revenue growth, maybe a little bit more accelerated, actually. If we move over to Europe, the growth revenue looks the same, so I won't bore you with the same sort of picture. It's almost identical. But it's sort of interesting maybe here to think about the market and how it's comprised in terms of competitors. Again, this is in the digital platform space, so it excludes taxis and other providers. So what we see here is Uber is dominant, right? So it has about 60% of the market. FreeNow, which is a relatively new platform, is doing quite well. And then you have a few others. So Bolt, which is the Estonian platform, used to be called Taxify, has about 10%. But this is obviously all of Europe. And so it's worth noting a few things. For example, Bolt is very strong in Eastern Europe. They're probably the market leader there, like a little bit ahead of Uber. Ola, which is an Indian platform, we'll come back to them in a moment, is like so tiny, it's like 0.2%. But they're a big player in London. So in London, they're quite large. I don't remember the number off the top of my head now, gosh. I can probably safely say like around 15 to 20%. I think that's probably conservative. And so that's, that's pretty important, especially because London is the most important market on the continent. And London is one of the most important markets for Uber, for example. Anyways, so you kind of get a sense of what the sort of market looks like. So going to India, so I just mentioned Ola is an Indian-based platform. They obviously dominated the Indian market early. Uber has been catching up. Uber, as many of us know, expanded globally very quickly and very early, but has since retreated from a number of key markets. So China, sort of most famously, where they got into a price war, which they lost with Didi, and essentially sold out to Didi. A little bit after that, that was around 2016. Around 2016, 2017, they also withdrew from Southeast Asia, another very important market in this space. The key players there are Grab, which is Singapore-based, and the Indonesia-based Gojek. So Uber really has concentrated its efforts. This was sort of the idea towards the back end of Travis Kalanick's time, and it's kind of continued under Dara, to focus on the US, Europe, Latin America, and a few other markets, including India. So India is important for them. Okay, big picture, what do we see? So Uber, no surprise, the sort of dominant player. Didi in China, Grab, very, very important. Gojek, again, the Indonesian firm. Lyft, once you look at it globally, is relatively small. And then you have some of these other players as well. Cabify, the Spanish company. So this is kind of the sense that we have of sort of like what ride-hailing looks like. And again, this is, in many ways, I'm kind of familiar. But I mean, the story hasn't just been a smooth one of just revenue growth sort of right up until the pandemic, right? As we all know, there have been lots of political and regulatory battles along the way from the first moment of disruption, because really what was being disrupted was the incumbent taxis, right? And so what I want to go through very quickly is just to kind of give a flavor of some of the kinds of reactions to ride-hailing over the course of the last several years. And then I'm going to come back at the very end to what's going on right now, okay? All right. So this is really about market entry more than anything else, right? So I mean, much of the story of ride-hailing can be sort of captured by a sort of taxi versus Uber narrative, even though everything I've shown you thus far is to make the point that it's not just about Uber, even though Uber, is the market leader. If we look around the world, we see a lot of sort of this, right? So you guys may say, okay, fine, it's Paris, there's lots of protests, people like to go into the streets, burn stuff, and so forth. But you get this kind of story, right? So anti-Uber protests in Paris a few years ago, burning of tires. So I'm from Jamaica. This is like a really common sort of sight. When we're really upset about various forms of regulation, you burn tires, especially now that I think about it, now that I'm working in this space. When I was growing up, a lot of it was always around bus fare increases, which would make my mobility and transportation colleagues smile, I think. Anyways, so burning tires in the streets of Paris, one of the things that Uber has done, not just in Paris, but I think globally, has helped to solidify a kind of worker identity for taxi drivers. So here, je suis taxi, I am taxi. Long live Uber. So that's death to Uber. Right, so this is the kind of response we see in Paris. And so we see similar things in other parts of Europe, though, I mean, certainly it's probably exemplified in the Parisian case. Okay, what if we step outside of Europe, right? So if we look at Southeast Asia, for example, which I've mentioned once or twice, the dominant mode of sort of mobility for people in Southeast Asia, as in many other parts of Asia, are two-wheelers, right? So motorcycle taxis, right? As many probably know from either growing up there or spending time there. So in Bangkok, for example, these guys, motorcycle taxis, who wear these orange vests, which sort of gives them essentially a right to provide this service from particular locations, essentially particular street corners in Bangkok, are the incumbents. They're very, very important. They comprise around 200,000 workers in Bangkok. Bangkok is a city of about 12 million, sorry, a little more than 12 million. So they're an important part of the labor market, like important proportionally, but it's also worth noting they're very important politically. So in some of the protests in the late 2000s, early 20-teens, which was some of the pro-democracy protests back in that time, the motorcycle taxi drivers played a hugely important role in supporting the then prime minister. This is worth noting given that, as many may know, Thailand is under military dictatorship right now. So these kinds of politics are important. And so it's useful, this is a way of simply saying that when we think about these kind of market dynamics, they're not at all divorced from broader political dynamics. So that's just something for us to bear in mind. It may come back again later on. Okay, so in Bangkok, these guys are the important ones. This industry was also sort of disrupted. So Grab was an early mover into the two-wheeler space. Very sort of similar sort of approach. I don't know if anyone in here has ever used an app to get a two-wheeler, but it's basically the same as getting an Uber in the US or in Europe or in other parts of the world. And again, we see protests, right? So these are the same guys in the orange jackets, the motorcycle taxi drivers, protesting a four-wheeler provider of Grab services. So you can see sort of Grab on the windscreen of this car. And we see sort of similar things. So, signs, slogans, sort of this, as you might guess, sort of burning the vest. So the vest costs money. It's not entirely different from a medallion, just for our purposes here. So it has itself a value. And of course, people were very much worried that with the entry of ride hailing, it would challenge the value of the vest. So people are burning the vest, sort of showing, this is all sort of political theater for politicians, sort of showing the way in which the value of their investment in the vest has been destroyed by ride hailing, by Grab. And so forth, right? And then coming back to the US, again, protests here as well. So we can think about in New York, this is from about, I think, 2 years ago, if I remember correctly. Anti-Uber and Lyft protests in the city. Much of this was downtown. Again, you see, sort of drivers protesting against Uber and Lyft. Interesting connections that are made between sort of tech and finance, so between sort of Silicon Valley and Wall Street. So the idea, fears are for drivers, not for Wall Street. So not even for tech bros in Silicon Valley, but for Wall Street investors. Again, this will come back to be important in a couple of ways. And so we see more of these kinds of protests. We also see counter-protests, very well organized, right? So these are, as you can see, they're all wearing Uber t-shirts. These are, as best as we know, Uber drivers who are protesting. This is all, by the way, on the steps of City Hall in New York, downtown. They're all protesting to say, look, don't regulate ride-hailing in the way that ride-hailing's opponents are asking, because this is important to us. This provides jobs, my car, my business, my family, et cetera, right? So there's contention and organization on both sides. So you see this backdrop, you can now see City Hall in the background. And finally, I should just note very quickly, this is now kind of seeming old, but it's still kind of interesting. It's old because it happened like 6 years ago. So this is how fast things move. So back in the earlier years of Uber, Uber came up with a way essentially of enlisting rider support for Uber. This is called the de Blasio feature on the app. Basically what it was is City Council at this time was considering various forms of regulating ride hailing. And so what this kind of feature did on the user interface is that if you look down here at the very bottom, you can see the normal things you see, right? You can get like an Uber Black, Uber X, Uber Pool, et cetera. But there's a de Blasio feature, right? So if you tap de Blasio, basically what it shows is that the idea was this will be what will happen if the regulations that City Hall and the City Council is considering pass. 25-minute wait, of course, we all know that's terrible if you're taking an Uber, right? So the idea was, if you don't want to see this happen, just tap this button right here and you'll send a message to City Hall letting them know your preferences. And City Council around this time got about 1.6 million emails, okay? So again, just to say that the politics and the sort of various strategies that are used at this time in basically pushing for support for and against is very, very important. Okay. Finally, we can't talk about New York and taxis without talking about ride-hailing, rather, we're talking about taxis. Of course, the medallions are crucial in this sort of license. As many of us know, the value of medallions, which used to be a quite stable and good investment, up to maybe like 7 or 8 years ago, has tanked right around this time, around 2014. And there are two reasons for this. So ride-hailing is part of the story, but it's not the entire story. Another part of the story is basically financialization techniques that are used in the medallion financing industry that basically mirror what we saw in the subprime industry, involving a lot of smaller financial institutions in New York State, especially credit unions. But anyway, the combination of finance and this sort of technology, this sort of technological change, have vastly reduced the value of medallions. Again, this is something that we're familiar with, but it's just worth noting that this is from a really great New York Times piece that was done, long series. This has had really, really important human consequences. It's just important to note. So as many of us know, there are a number of driver suicides, also on the steps of City Hall in New York. And so here you can see a combination of a protest and a memorial for some of the drivers who killed themselves as a result of the value of their medallions falling. So all this is to say that this is a very fraught political environment, one where regulation is absolutely crucial. So let's talk about the regulatory approaches, what has happened since. Okay, so we think about the politics of ride-hailing, and again, if we take a kind of global, so I'm dancing around because this sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. The questions really have been the following. Should cities allow or ban ride-hailing? Is sort of maybe the biggest question in many respects. A second and related one, which is very crucial, especially in terms of the politics, is ride-hailing fair competition or not? All right, so this question, this sort of moral questions of fairness are always important in markets and have been central in many of the debates that we see around ride-hailing. And then finally, this one is really key, especially today. How should we think about workers in the so-called gig economy, the platform economy? Should they be employees or independent entrepreneurs? And this is the one I'm going to turn to in the last few minutes of my presentation. But first, let me just say something general about global reactions to ride-hailing. So there are a couple ways in which we can try to conceptualize the very complex and sort of diverse kinds of reactions that we see to ride-hailing around the world. On one hand, in some places, we see a relatively open market. I would say Boston is sort of an example of this to some extent. Cities like Dar es Salaam, where myself and some of my members of my research lab have been working, is another example. But you also have very much closed markets. Berlin, Germany in general, but I mean, this is really a city phenomenon, an urban phenomenon. So Berlin would be a really good example where Uber and other apps are effectively banned. Tokyo is another example here. Many people find that surprising. So there's a spectrum on one hand between an open versus closed market. And there are many cities obviously that fall in the middle, and some go back and forth. London is a really important example here. So some may remember that Uber has gone back and forth in losing its license and regaining its license and losing its license in London. And London, basically, when you think about the UK, is really the important market. It's all about London. And Ola actually has had the same sort of issue of losing its license to provide services. So some cities toggle back and forth. You have some spaces where I would say there's more sort of informal market regulation. I can talk more about that in Q&A if people are interested. And then finally, there are some cities where you have what I call formal data-driven modes of market regulation. New York and São Paulo will be two examples. So what do I mean by data-driven market regulation? Well, one of the big problems or challenges for regulators around platforms generally, but certainly in the, certainly in the mobility space, as some know, is the reluctance of mobility platforms to share data with regulators, right? So that they'll be able to sort of figure out how they do pricing, how they do movement, and so regulators could regulate in ways that they saw fit for the cities in which they were. Two cities that have had some success in this regard are New York and São Paulo. So I'll just show very quickly, very quick examples. So in New York, for instance, there are two key issues here that were at play. Congestion, which resulted in a cap on vehicles at around, the number ended up being around 89,000. This is right before the pandemic. And around labor and working conditions. And this is really interesting because New York was one of the only, very few places, São Paulo too, but very few places where there have been, that I'm aware of, where there's been regulatory intervention on the labor side. Here the idea was to instigate or initiate a minimum wage floor of $17.22 per hour, which was done. Okay? We don't see this in most other parts of the, certainly of this country or even of the world. São Paulo also interestingly had a really kind of cool and pretty sophisticated way of doing regulation of mobility platforms. They basically, again, were able to get data from the various platforms there. So Uber and 99 being the most important ones. 99 is a Brazilian company which has since been taken over by Didi. And the idea was to regulate in the public interest. And they did this by basically essentially intervening on the pricing of rides to promote things like off-peak driving, providing rides in low, in areas that don't have very good access to public transportation, to encourage women drivers, to provide sort of broader participation on the labor market side, et cetera. So there's a kind of sophisticated policy mechanism there, which I could talk more about, but I'll skip for now. So point being that we see all these kind of regulatory responses. This is the São Paulo stuff, which I'll just skip, that we see. But the thing I want to close with is on the labor side, because this is where I think a lot of the debate is right now. And so what's going on the labor side? Of course, it's the classification debate that really is crucial. And here, I think it's worth us taking a little bit of a step back and thinking about the broader context in which ride-hailing has emerged. Right, so one part of the story is, of course, the technological story, right? APIs, apps, new kinds of algorithms, data, et cetera. And I mean, of course, that's not unimportant. But I would suggest that that's not the most important, or certainly not the only important factor in the rise of ride-hailing. A big part of it is the broader global political economic shifts that we've seen over the course of the last few decades. I mean, we can broadly characterize this under neoliberalism and globalization. But what has it meant? Some of the things which are very familiar to us, right? So vertical disintegration of the Fordist firm, various forms of outsourcing and offshoring of work in, from companies in the industrialized world to countries in the developing world. The decline of the sort of good jobs of the sort of union-strong period in places like the United States in the 50s and 60s, where we get now temporary work, zero-hour contracts, even in places like Germany, even places that we tend to hold up as exemplars of a strong and sort of pro-labor regulation. This, I would suggest, is what provides the context for regulatory and legislative initiatives like Prop 22 in California, right? The sort of issue around worker classification. I'll just simply quickly say much of that is a story in industrialized countries, but even in developing countries, similarly, we can think about some of the broader background transformations that have taken place. The rise of informality in labor markets that essentially make workers more available for doing the kinds of gig work that's essential for making the platform model work. Now, let me close by just showing a slide which maybe some people have seen before. So this is a slide that is often used when talking about technology-induced technology-induced change over time. Has anyone seen this slide before? Anything similar? So basically what this shows is a divergence starting around the end of the Second World War in the mid-1940s to the present, the divergence between labor productivity and profits. And basically the idea is that from around the mid-1940s to maybe the 1970s, a period that's often known as the Fordist Keynesian period of the golden age of capitalism, you see worker productivity and profits basically moving in lockstep. So what does that mean? It means that there's a broader sort of social contract between firms, and well, not just between firms and labor, but broadly orchestrated by the government, where growth in the firm and benefits from growth in the firm will be distributed to workers. All of this began to change around the 1970s. And so in the 1970s, you see a big divergence between labor productivity, which we see here in black, average compensation, which we see here in blue, and this green line, which is basically workers, non-supervisory workers' wages. Right? So essentially, the growth story more or less continues, but workers aren't sharing in these gains in the same way in the post-1970s period as they were in the previous period, the sort of golden age of capitalism. Okay? And so this is the period that we see of the globalization, neoliberalism, offshoring, et cetera, those kinds of dynamics that I mentioned before. You see a big divergence here. So this is often thought about as a kind of technological story, right? So there's some technological changes that took place at this time, and this has led to, labor-saving technologies being used more and so forth. But instead, I would suggest a different sort of story. A story where we think about this as a shift in the balance of workplace power, right? The ability for workers to negotiate and to capture the kinds of gains, or to share rather in the kind of gains with essentially management that they were able to in the Fordist Keynesian period. So it's another way essentially of narrating this exact same story. So this is where I want to end, and I'll just say that the classification debate that we see today, I would suggest, can be seen within this kind of context. This question of whether workers should be considered to be employees or independent entrepreneurs is not independent from the broader shifts that we've seen over the course of the last few decades. One where 4 or 5 decades ago, at least in the United States, the debate will be sort of moot, because the idea was there was a kind of sharing of gains and rewards from growth in the economy between management, owners of capital, and labor. All of that has broken down and left us in a place where workers who still retain these kinds of jobs, first of all, don't get the same kind of wages relative to the kinds of growth that we see. And secondly, we've seen the rise of much more tenuous kinds of labor contracts. So again, even in the United States context, there are more workers who are available to do the kinds of gig work that underpin the platform economy. And so this is one of the key areas, I think, now, as the courts are debating what to do with this classification debate, is going to play a big role in determining the next steps for the platform economy. Thank you.
Just a quick comment about Bangkok. I travel there quite frequently, and I think that the motorcycle industry is less competitive with Grab than the meter taxis. The motorcycles tend to attract a lower echelon of riders, people who are lower class, going to work, can afford less. It may be 10 baht for a ride, where a meter taxi may be triple that. But one effect Grab did have is that for many years, the taxi meters, even though they have meters, they don't run them. And you have to negotiate up front what you're going to pay. And they did an early version of surge pricing. If they knew it was tough to get a taxi, they'd raise where they want to negotiate. And there's no law like there is in New York that says they must take you. They don't like what they've negotiated, they wave goodbye, and you're stuck. What Grab has done is it's add another element where people can have a guaranteed price. They know in advance what it's going to be, and they're guaranteed a service. And full disclosure, I believe there's an MIT Sloan graduate who was one of the early managers of the Grab franchise in Thailand, so he was explaining this a little bit to me. So it's actually added a benefit, especially for business travelers and visitors who want something that's more predictable and also gives them a better climate, because you're riding a motorcycle, you're out in the heat and the humidity, whereas in a taxi or Grab, it's air conditioned and you don't have the noise and the pollution. So I think Bangkok has benefited from Grab, and I think there's been less of an impact on the motorcycle people. I'm going back in a couple weeks, and I'm happy to look into it a little bit more for you.
Yeah, that's super. Thanks very much. I'd be keen to know, maybe we can chat after, who the MIT Sloan grad is. I'd love to chat with them. So I totally agree with you, and that's been my experience as well, 100%. In other versions of this presentation, when I talk about other parts of this work, one of the things that I try to highlight is, in fact, the resilience of the motorcycle taxi sector in Bangkok against platforms. That's broken down a little bit up to the last time I was there, which is like right before, towards the end of 2019, right before we all got stuck at home. But I think that's absolutely right. And I think part of the story there has to do with how mobility is organized in Bangkok and some features that are kind of unique to Bangkok. Another part of that, which is very important, is the kind of relationship that exists between the motorcycle taxi drivers and the state. So the police, politicians, the military, so military figures, which are increasingly important now with the military sort of back in power. So those vests that I was talking about before, the way in which those vests are traded, owned, and so forth is connected with this nexus of politicians, bureaucrats, the military, with the police serving as a kind of sort of on-the-ground managers of some of the political sort of dynamics there. So that's also, I think, an important part of this. But yeah, no, I totally agree with the taxis, and yeah, especially for tourists. I mean, especially like when I go there, for example, then I'm unable to negotiate, because even if the driver speaks English, they oftentimes will not speak English in order to. So I 100% agree with that. Yeah.
I've learned how to count in Thai, so I can do this.
I need to learn that from you as well.
Okay. Yep. Okay. We're past our time. We have some tours coming up. If you're in one of the tours, meet at the main ballroom. There's some tables there to meet your tour guides. Thank you, Jason, for joining us here.
My pleasure. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks for closing it up for us.
Enjoy the tours.